Yeah, well, thanks for inviting me on, Luke. It's really looking forward to the conversation. So, yeah, as you mentioned, my name's Rav. I think best way to describe myself is a recovering software executive. I don't think you ever really particularly get over it. About 20 plus years in enterprise software, and in the last 5 years, I've been working in the world of early stage venture capital.
Awesome, good stuff. And you put out a really great article recently, which is, it's one of the reasons I wanted to speak to you, but actually it was off the back of seeing you at the customer conference earlier on this year, which I think as far as CS events go, I'd say it's one of the ones that's really up there because it does bring in a different perspective. It's not just CS people patting each other on the back. It's actually CEOs, it's leaders of organizations. It's those who have a different perspective when it comes to CS and what the value is within the organization. And I think what you were talking about at the time, certainly from a revenue perspective, it's an area that is, I would say, maybe a little bit of a sore subject for a lot of CS professionals, something that they're not particularly comfortable talking about as a collective. And I think that's changing because there is much more of a focus now on customer success and what value it brings to an organization from a revenue perspective. So I really enjoyed the article. It's titled The Opportunities for Customer Success. And I think it does really provide more of a guide as to how you can become more revenue fit within your organization. And I'd love to be able to kind of talk through that. There is going to be a link in the comments box to the article. We'll post this on YouTube. There'll be a full description on there with links. But yeah, I'd love to dive into that and kind of take it from there, really. Before we do that, what I'd also love to do is I need a name for this podcast. So I'm going to do a giveaway, a classic podcast giveaway where if you watch this and you can think of a great name for a CS podcast that focuses more on revenue and value add, then put it in the comments below and we'll do some form of giveaway, which I'm sure.
I'm looking forward to seeing what we come up with.
Yeah. Keep it clean. It clean. So yeah, love to jump into the article and really tell me first of all, like why did you take time out of your busy schedule to create it?
Oh, interesting question, Luke. So late 2022, November 2022, I put out an article called "The Problem with Customer Success," and it was did generate a lot of reads, a lot of questions, a lot of debate, and which was, I think, really healthy. And in that article, I talked about three things, which is, despite being around for a long time, customer success still doesn't have a sort of standard or credible definition. It's very contextual. It's very different. There is a strain of commercial aversion, I think, in the profession. And that's, comes from being on, unfortunately, often the tail end of poor sales practices. And then the third part I wrote about was community affirmation. So it's a very strong community of practitioners. You talked about the customer conference, for example, but sometimes that can create a bit of an echo chamber, and it can sometimes get in the way of evolving the profession. And after I wrote that article and engaged with a lot of people in questions, etc., I was thinking, well, what are the practical steps someone can do? I kind of framed what, from my perspective now, where I see some of the issues, and made some suggestions. But what are the practical things? And I spent quite a long time thinking about, well, what are the practical things someone can do without anyone else's permission, that don't require an organizational change, that don't require having to go on massive training courses or changing your incentive plan? And that's really what spurred me to write the article. So it's been gestating for a while, but it was really the second part of that article from November 2022 is what we're talking about today.
Yeah. Because a lot of the language actually that's used within this article, it reminded me, it was really reminiscent of what you said at the customer conference. And I found at the time there were probably some divided opinions, and maybe
I think so.
And maybe that was more it exposes individuals not weakness, I think that's unfair, but their kind of lack of commerciality. And
maybe, Luke, but I think there's also a thing about status quo. Status quo is very comfortable. It's something that we understand, and that's not just in CS. That's in I look at the way SaaS startups are built. It's very status quo, right? It hasn't really changed a great deal from the on-premises era, even though the technology, distribution, licensing is all different. We try to squeeze the old world into the new one. So I think, yes, it may be a little bit of sort of either lack of experience or knowledge or comfort around revenue, but I think it's more of a cultural thing that, you know, groups tend to want to gravitate towards the status quo because that's the safest thing.
Yeah.
And I may have built my career or my business or my brand on the status quo.
Sure.
So that's kind of was my takeaway from the event and the panel, and certainly from a lot of the conversations that I have.
Yeah, and you do hear a lot of the same voices, I think, on LinkedIn, sharing very similar opinions, and they do kind of gravitate towards one another. And that's why, again, I like bringing different voices out there who can bring a different perspective. I think it's really, really important.
Yeah.
Great, good stuff. So the first part of the article talks about the drive for efficiency, and ultimately what the hidden opportunity looks like. So talk to me about that kind of opening segment.
So I think if I were to, again, go back to November 2022, when I published the first half of this article, we were starting to, because of the macroeconomic situation, general uncertainty in the world, starting to see quite a shift in the fundraising environment. So the bar got a lot higher to raise money. Interest rates started to go up, so the money wasn't as cheap anymore.
Yeah.
And so the kind of good times we'd had up to that point where we can just keep throwing money at this problem because the money is essentially free or close to being free. We can hire more people, figure it out. That started to diminish quite rapidly.
Yeah.
And I think as a result of that, there's been a lot more focus, both from investors, from boards, from senior leadership teams on efficiency. There used to be growth at all costs. Doesn't matter if we're not making any money. Let's just keep growing. There's a promise of future monetization. Now, we're not saying all startups have to become profitable. That's not what they're really designed to do in the early stages. But there is much more scrutiny on how we're spending the money, how long is our runway, how efficient are we being. And I think that's quite a shift of landscape for a lot of us who may have spent our, people who are younger than me certainly, who may have spent their entire working career in tech being in that environment where money was not a problem and growth was all that it was about.
Yeah. I think we saw the shift was certainly for us from a recruitment perspective. When we talk about headcount reduction, that was probably around October 2022.
Interesting. And my article came out in November, so that would tally about right. Yeah,
and that's when we started to see a lot of the bigger players certainly make redundancies. They're the individuals that make a lot of noise about it, and then again, it's that gravity from smaller companies looking at what the bigger players are doing and thinking, crikey, we can
do the same. Yeah, I mean, there's obviously, when these macro shocks or changes happen, there's obviously always a little bit of a knee-jerk reaction, right? So there's always this kind of period where it feels like the sky's falling in and redundancies left, right, and center. Thankfully, things have calmed down. We're nowhere near the kind of interest rates that we had before. We still have inflation in the system. We still have conflict in Europe. We still got a big COVID bill to be paying, right? Just kind of from loss of productivity. So things are structurally, quite different. But I think that focus on efficiency it is with us now. Like, it's with us from now on. It's part of the structure now of tech and how we scale companies.
Yeah, and I don't want to focus too much, I guess, on the market, because that is a much bigger piece. But where do you see things kind of moving at the moment? Do you feel there's
it would be no surprise to you and anyone listening, AI, right? So that is where the money's going. That's where the funding's going. It is, although AI in many forms has been around for a long time, it's now at the stage where people understand its transformational capability, right?
Yeah.
It's a technology which, on the surface appears to work like magic, and that's always a sign that we're seeing a big technological shift. So that's really what we're seeing in the market. Either people adding AI capability to their existing stack or building on some of these new technologies, really innovative solutions.
Yeah, awesome. There was a part that I picked out actually from the article, and if I keep looking over here, because I have a
no problem.
50-inch screen just glaring at me with it on there. But there's, I'd say, quite a punchy line saying, ingrained perception held by many startup boards and investors is that customer success is not an integral part of the revenue generation element within the organization, and which obviously then leads to cost cutting, being more risk averse. So talk to me about that section. I thought that was quite poignant.
Yeah, interesting. So it goes back to what we were just touching on there, Luke, which is the status quo. So if we were to look at a sales marketing funnel, that funnel we're all familiar with, that triangle, if that's successful, at the end of it is revenue, right?
Yeah.
And we still view the world at that, okay, well, we've got the revenue, our job's done. Everything after that now is service and support, right? Yeah. And again, that comes entirely from the on-premises era, because our customers were making a capital expenditure. They were having to buy and run and host the infrastructure for your solution.
Yeah.
They were perpetually licensed. So we sold it to them once and they owned it forever, right? Yeah. And it would probably take them 9, 10, 12 months, 2 years to roll the thing out because of all of that cost. So it's hard for them to ditch it. Switching cost was hard. They owned it in perpetuity. We got pretty much all the money up front, which was another thing, and we could account for it up front. And then what we figured was, after that sales marketing funnel started delivering revenue, everything was services and support. Now, 20 plus years ago, we changed the delivery model. We made it cloud, continuous updates, renting the license on subscription rather than actually owning the software outright. But we still are left with that legacy and culture of building companies where our job's finished at contract signature.
Yeah.
So that's really where that statement in the article comes from. The mindset, and this is no one's fault, this is just business culture. The mindset of, oh, well, we get revenue and then everything else is services and support, still very, very prevalent.
Yeah.
Very prevalent, including from people who invest in some of the most radical new technologies out there. Lots of those investors made their money back in the the on-premises era.
Yeah.
Right? So, that mindset then paying it. You read any sales book, it's kind of organized that way. Services and support after we get the revenue, right? And
interesting.
Yeah. It's a cultural thing too. Yeah.
So I guess that leads really into like the change of that perception then, and what CS professionals can do to, I guess, improve that. And you laid out some really great steps within the article. And I think the first part, which I love actually, is and it reminds me again, I keep referring to the customer conference, which is a great plug for those guys. I think they've got one in Ireland coming up soon.
That's
actually.
Right. Yeah.
But yes, it's speaking the internal language of revenue, and in brackets internal.
Yeah. So I think if we think about this idea of squeezing the old world into the new world, and that's the kind of culture and structure that we still have in tech. How do you go about shifting that? How do you go about shifting the perception, even if it's at an unconscious level, that after we've got the revenue, everything else is services and support?
Yeah.
Right? Like, how do we do that? So one of the things that I mentioned in the article is, if I'm working with customers, I have a very big outward focus, quite rightly, right? I'm being asked by my company, I'm being paid to think outwardly. My customers are out there, we are in here.
Yeah.
And one of the unintentional byproducts of that is, if you're a good customer person, is you're so focused on being outwardly focused, you forget, actually, I've got a customer internally.
Yeah.
Right. I have all these other people internally, the board, the senior leadership team, other leaders, other functions, that I'm not speaking in their language. I'm busy speaking to the customer in their language because I'm being paid and asked to look after them. So you can see why this happens. It's completely unintentional. My point was really, actually, if you learn the language, if people talk about love languages, learning your partner's love language. If you learn the love language of your startup, it's revenue.
Yeah.
Right. Every discussion, everything about forecasting, territory, planning, NRR, GRR, all of this stuff is revenue. So it's really not asking you to do anything different. It's asking you just to talk about it in a different language, in a language that's much more familiar and resonant to your internal customer.
Yeah.
Because when you start speaking the same language with people, A, they start listening, and B, they have an intrinsic understanding of what you're saying. And that then promotes, that hopefully increased understanding promotes much more connotation of value. Oh, I actually understand what you do. I can see the value of it now because you're talking to me about it in a way that I completely understand.
Yeah. And you gave some really good examples of this. And it's funny, if you want some examples, if you're listening to this and you're a candidate, and I would 100% advise you to start thinking like this from a CV perspective, because there are a lot of vanilla profiles out there which talk about I manage a book of business, but the framing you used was around I manage a territory of X million ARR, for example, and you just give a very kind of clear value added metric. And I think anyone watching this, have a look at Rav's profile on LinkedIn, scroll down to Slack and have a look at that, because that's a really clear, here's the value to the business. And any CEO, any head of CS looking to hire someone and they want to ask the question, do they understand the commercials of their role? But there we go. It's a really clear metric. So I think that's something I would recommend people do. Take a look at that.
I think actually the CV point's a really illustrative one, Luke. It's actually a really good example you give there, because I'm still a person who looks at hundreds of CVs. I support my portfolio companies with hiring. I have a lot of people send me CVs. And the ones that always stand out are the ones that show achievements.
Yeah.
I think a lot of, in particular, a lot of CS CVs that I look at are activities. These are the things that I do.
Yeah.
And that's because I'm listing the activities because they're in the job description, right? And the ones that make it into the yes pile for interview are like, these are the activities I did, and this is the outcome of those activities. So I got assigned 20 customers that were $3 million in total, and I grew them, or they grew this much, right? Yeah. So it's actually then making the connection to the reader, because I think what might be useful for anyone listening is if you are thinking about how you pitch yourself externally to a recruiter or internally to a team, there's a yes, no, or maybe pile. And you want your resume to go in the yes pile, or if you're lucky, maybe the maybe. So think about, how do I get into that pile of papers? Because you'll get in there if you can list the achievements rather than the activities, right?
Yeah, that's brilliant. It's really, really useful. And I think, again, it's probably an exercise we should do is create some templating, because I always say to individuals, on your point, just keep the CV like really simple. Don't leave lots open to interpretation, because if, like you said, if you're getting hundreds of CVs through, if you have to spend lots of time figuring it out, you're just not going to bother.
Correct. Yeah.
Make it easy is the thing I always say.
And I think that goes to how you may want to think about communicating internally, right? So
that's a good point.
CEO stops you in the lift. Luke, what team are you in? I'm in the customer success team, CEO. Oh, well, what do you guys do? If you then actually then talk about, well, you know, I'm the customer's trusted advisor, and
yeah.
we you know, we do EBRs, QBRs, blah blah blah. I'm going to walk away nonplussed, going, I'm not sure how this is aligning to the very pressing goals that the company has.
Yeah.
If you basically say, we drive incremental ARR, or we're here to accelerate the journey from ARR to NRR, this is how we do it, I'll understand that.
Yeah.
Like I'll understand, I understand ARR, I understand NRR. Oh, and you're telling me that you help speed up the journey from one to the other.
Yeah.
And you do it this way, right? You do it this way by, well, we get things deployed really quickly, or we bring our specific skill on the product to help them do X, Y, Z. But we do that to go from ARR to NRR as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
That I think is much more resonant.
Agreed. Yeah. That's awesome. So next section, we talk about, and this reads very, if you read this on a document, you would say, oh, this is talking about sales. So territory planning, reporting, and forecasting. Talk to me about that.
Yeah. So I think, again, it's like, well, what can I do that's within my control that doesn't require anybody's permission? I can get a spreadsheet, or I could go to my, CRM, and I can create my list of customers, and I can say, well, this is my territory. I don't have to ask anyone's permission to do that, right? Yeah. And then you can decide, what do you want to track in this territory? Not activities. What other things do you want? I mean, you can track activities, you should, but my outcomes from those activities, right? So what do I want to track, and how do I want to report on it, right? This is really trying to present what you do in, again, the language of the internal organization, right? Yeah. All the go-to-market functions are reporting, they're tracking, they're forecasting. They're doing it on deals, pipeline, revenue, SQLs, MQLs, all these things. Well, what's your version of those things, right? Yeah. It's going to be different in every company, but ultimately, you could decide that you want to track, well, I want to see how license growth is happening across my territory. right? I want to track that week on week, month on month. I want to maybe track and report on are specific high value features being, adopted in my territory. I might want to just track when onboarding's completed, right? And how long it's taking. And I might want to compare that month on month. I think regardless of whether you're compensated on it, you should really track the gross and net revenue retention, because ultimately all the things that you're doing, that's the outcome the company's looking for.
Yeah.
Right. You're doing all this stuff, Luke. Great. Sounds great. But if you don't tell me what that leads to or what it's influencing, I won't understand the value that you're adding. Right. So the whole idea of that is just to say, do what you're doing right now. Simply think about it, organize and present it in a way that the company understands. That's natural.
Yeah. Really interesting. And I think it's.
By the way, I should point out, there's probably a lot of CS people doing this who are watching this who do this already. They're like, I've got a tracking spreadsheet, blah, blah, blah. That's great. That means you're doing it. It's just maybe then changing the language about how you talk about it.
Yeah.
Here's my territory. Here's my forecast for license activation growth. And for no other reason, this is just great for your own career development and your own drive as an individual to say, hey, I'm going to give myself some targets, right? I'm going to try and get these numbers to move from this month to next month or this quarter to next quarter. I want to see my own progress. It might help you make the case for promotion, right? That, you're tracking this stuff and you're showing material movement.
Yeah. Awesome. If you're watching this and NRR or GRR is a new concept, simply put, how do you calculate it?
So at a very super high level, gross revenue retention is to say, basically, we have a certain amount of revenue in a certain period where we may have renewals. How much of that revenue did we retain? It's a straight percentage number. So, right, did I retain 100% of it? Did I retain 90% of it? Because I had 15 customers this quarter that were coming up for renewal. Yeah. The net revenue retention takes into account any churn, any downsell. People might renew, but they might renew at a lower level, for example, or change plan or less licenses. But it also includes any upsell or expansion.
Yeah.
And so that number ideally would be 100% or above. So I may have lost some revenue, but I made up for it by growing in other areas in my territory. So that's what it is at a super high level. You can just Google what the formulas are. They're pretty straightforward. They're not rocket science. But conceptually, that's what it is. If I have a territory, let's take that language, and that territory has $1 million coming up for renewal this quarter, the gross number will be the percentage of how much of that million I retained. The net number will be how much did I retain, how much did I lose, and then how much did I add on top of that?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Right. So if you're calculating your NRR and it's above 100%, you're on
ideally.
You're on the winner. Okay.
Yeah.
And then
there's some people who will argue about the value of NRR. It doesn't speak to value, but you can have that argument. But what it is a proxy for customers are willing to do more business with you. If they're willing to do more business with you, one has to assume it's on the basis that you are delivering your product as services, delivering some kind of value. Otherwise, they just go someplace else.
Yeah.
And they're not spoiled for choice, pretty much. Right?
Yeah. It's quite interesting because I put a post out recently on LinkedIn regarding, I guess, what you should measure customer success under. What are the core metrics? And again, a lot of it was very customer focused, and the answer always being, as long as we're doing right by our customers, as long as we're keeping them happy, as long as we're hitting their objectives, we'll ultimately generate more revenue. It just feels very non-committal. And what you're saying here is you're still doing that. You're not changing those behaviors to your customers. All you're doing is you're effectively stood in the middle between your customer and your business, and you're taking that information and then translating that into a digestible language to your board, to the people that you're working with internally. Yeah. So that's
I'll give you a really good example. I sat in the leadership team in a company which was pretty much obsessed with doing QBRs and EBRs. And the business had basically educated the board that this was a measure of success, right? How many we did. And I'm sitting in the US in this offsite. My opposite number is like, we did 65 executive reviews and we did 100 this quarter, blah, all very impressive. Comes to me and someone asked me the question, we didn't do any. what do you mean? I go, well, this quarter we didn't do any EBRs, we didn't QBRs. And it's like you can hear the collective intake of breath in the room.
Yeah.
So, but this quarter's NRR was 144.
Yeah, mic drop.
Right. So what I'm saying is it's fine to do that stuff, but if you can't connect it to the outcome we're actually trying to drive as a business, then what's the point? The reason we didn't do any is I polled all the customers, I spoke to all of them, and they were all very polite and said, some version of, we think this is more useful for you than it is for us.
Interesting.
Right. Right. And so we found different ways to engage with them and different ways to deliver value. Right. So I think it's perfectly fine and correct to think about, well, I've got to help my customer achieve their goals because they bought this thing to solve a pain. And we have to demonstrate that we are solving that pain. Because if we don't, and preferably we're helping them demonstrate they're solving the pain as quickly as possible. If we don't have any right to come back to them and do more business. The point is the one that you made, Luke, is simply just presenting all of that slightly differently internally in the language that your company understands.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's the concern that it drives a different behavior. But again, it just reverts back to you're not really changing anything. You're just taking the information you've got and representing it. This is
correct. So if you were to parse the article, there's nothing in it that says you need to do stuff with your customers differently.
Yeah.
Or you need to behave differently, or you need to think differently, or you need to go on this training course and learn how to do X, Y, Z. It basically just says, present what you're doing this way. You'll probably find the door is much more open and receptive to presenting it a certain way.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Brilliant. I guess a couple of questions. So we talk about assigned territory and assigned customers.
Yeah.
What's the kind of real distinction between them if you were looking at this and thinking about, okay, I need to start thinking about these things?
In practical reality, nothing. It's really a presentation thing. It's the language. It's like, well, my business understands the concept of territory because we have sales territory, we have marketing territories. It may not necessarily understand the concept of assigned counts as well, or may not be able to just draw the distinction in mind that these are the two of the same things.
Yeah, fine.
So the minute you start talking about, well, Luke, this is my territory, and I'm a member of the leadership team, I'm like, does that mirror the sales territory then? Yeah, that's right. It mirrors Luke's territory, and we work quite closely together because while he's closing new business, I'm trying to keep a track of where we are with existing.
Yeah.
Immediately, I can start to see the value of what you're doing, right?
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah. Makes sense.
If you sort of say my assigned accounts, it is the same thing, but I think it draws maybe a different inference.
Yeah.
That's a thing that you're doing on your own, that you own. They're yours. I don't know if there's anyone else involved there. So I might just draw the inference that, Luke's responsible for upsell, cross-sell, MPS, CSAT, renewal, and all the technical, because you're saying, I've got these assigned accounts.
Yeah.
Remembering, going back to unconsciously or consciously, everyone is still in the mode of, well, after we've got the revenue, everything else is services and support.
Good stuff. So another question was around, so what are the common mistakes CS teams make when they start, so this around the reporting side, when they start setting and tracking kind of quarterly targets, and kind of how can they avoid them?
Well, I'm not sure if it's a mistake. It's more just the mindset shift. And you talked about it, Luke, in relation to CVs. It's just focusing on tracking and reporting activities rather than the outcome. We did this many training sessions. We did this many onboarding sessions. Well, really what I'm interested in is how many customers did we fully onboard? Not how many sessions did we do, right? Or what I'm really interested in is not that I have 10 deployments running. I'm interested in the speed at which they're going, right? So it's really taking that thing we talked about, like how do you present your CV? Well, I should present my reporting and forecasting and planning on the basis of these are activities, but this is what the outcomes we're tracking to those activities. We talk a lot about customer outcomes, helping the customer do something quicker, faster, easier, cheaper, more of.
Yeah.
We tend not to do that on our internal focus. We tend to talk about the activities that we're doing.
Yeah.
I ran a team where when I inherited it, as far as I could tell, everyone was just either building training or delivering training, right? And I was like, I want to know how effective this is. So literally got everyone to do a timesheet for a couple of months, worked out how much time they were working on training preparation, training delivery, and then plotted the dates they delivered those training to the active usage to the customer and just found it didn't move the needle at all.
Okay.
Right? It's like, we should think about this differently. All right. And so we went to product, and they built something in the product, a bot, which would then help people to get familiar with the product. And so let's get everybody to go through the bot and then go on site to do some training. So they're all at a slightly higher level. So that was, that's an example of saying, well, if I just reported on the activity, we would be incredibly busy. But the company would quite legitimately ask, this is a really simple product. Why do we have to do so much training? Or why this investment? Because we couldn't tie it to any kind of outcome. Yeah.
Interesting. Great. So the next part I think is really interesting is getting connected to sales pipeline.
Yeah.
I'd love to dive into that. So I've got a couple of questions, but what the high level of this section, talk to me about it.
Yeah, so it's really about context. So I think part of the challenge with being in a customer function or a success function is, if you think about the go-to-market motion as a production line, I'm right at the end of it. There's sales, there's marketing, there's all this stuff that happens, and then a deal gets closed, and we're in that world of, well, we got the revenue, now it's services and support. I don't really often have a lot of context about the customer. Like, I'll go and do a bunch of research, I'll get given a bunch of stakeholders, but unless I develop some very time-consuming, convoluted, difficult handover process, which no one ever really wants to do because they want to move on to the next thing, do I know why they bought the product? Do I know what pain they were trying to solve? Do I know what the priority of those pains are? Do I know what the economic buyer is? Do I even know who the economic buyer is? Because actually, if I have a problem, I've got to have someone to go back to. Do I know what other products they were looking at? Do I know which stakeholders wanted to go with the competitor versus this one? Do I know who I'm going to be working with, right? Or who they've assigned? So it's just an idea. It's just a way of getting as much context as you possibly can without having to do a ton of extra work, because this customer is going to come to you at some point anyway. So the more you know about it earlier, just through listening and observation. And I think the second, hopefully happy byproduct of that is, you start to get more and more exposed through osmosis to the language of revenue that the company's using. You get more and more exposed to, this is how people talk about customers and prospects, and this is what the company really cares about. So you kind of, through osmosis, start to be able to get better exposure to that language as well, I think.
Yeah, interesting. And I think
I'll explain it another way. And apologies if anyone's listening and not watching. You sell up here in the organization.
Yeah.
And CS is typically working with people down there, right? And sometimes the people they're working with down there have no idea of the context of why this thing was bought as well.
Yeah.
Right. And so you get to all this sort of problem is like, oh, they're not turning up to calls, or they're busy with other stuff, or I'm chasing them up, they're not responding. Well, if you have the context of what was up here, you might be able to go back to the economic buyer and go, hey, look, this is all going well, but the team seems to be busy. Can we talk about some alternative strategies?
Yeah.
If you don't have that context or have exposure to those people because you weren't connected to the sales pipeline, you're going to be a stranger who's reaching out to them, and that economic buyers, well, I've moved on to the next thing. I did the hard thing. I bought it. Yeah.
Do you think remote working has impacted that kind of connected element of sales and customer success? Being able to just knock on the door of the sales director that's just sold something.
Yeah. It's a really good question. I honestly don't know. I mean, things are logistically obviously simpler if you can just get up and walk across to someone's desk. But given the plethora of tools that we have, the Slacks and the Zooms of the world, etc., call recordings, all that stuff, I think it's doable. Whether it's had an impact or I couldn't really say. I think you can get across the sales pipeline by just looking at the report in SFDC, right, or on HubSpot, right? Other CRMs are available. I mean, you could look at the report and go, actually, there's 3 things I want to know about. I'll go ping the AE and just ask some questions or something, right? So or I'll go to the Gong recording or whatever we're using, and I'll go listen to the last couple of calls, right? It's extra work, but that should stand you in better stead when the customer comes to you.
Yes, and I was going to ask about the practical steps, and you kind of highlighted a lot of them there. Is there anything else? If you're a CSM thinking about this right now, right, I want to get connected to the sales pipeline.
Yeah.
Is there any kind of practical steps you would advise them to take, or is it literally, look, the information's there, just seek it out before it
It's
lands.
hopefully there. It depends on how much sales rigor there is in the organization, how much discipline there is in recording calls or writing notes, or whether they're using a deal management framework like Medic or MedPick, and it's all structured and you can go and read it. It might not be there, but I think I used the word informally in the article. There's nothing stopping you informally going, well, Luke's got 5 deals that look like they're going to close this quarter, and I know that these ones are in the territory we have in common, so they're going to come to me, or they're in my segment, they're going to come to me. There's nothing stopping you putting 20 minutes in Luke's calendar going, I just want a quick download on these things, because they're going to come to me anyway, right? It's probably about being a bit more proactive rather than saying, well, I'm at the end of the production line, I've just got to wait for all this stuff to come to me and then try to figure it out after the fact, or try to get Luke to fill in this very detailed handover thing, which he's either not going to do because he's too busy, or he's going to do very briefly. Can I try and learn this information through osmosis or more informally and in the run up to it, so it's less friction for everyone?
I think it's the relay race analogy, isn't it? You want to be running with sales, not waiting for them to hand the baton over and then you almost start again.
Yeah. I think that's a great analogy, right? It's like actually, if you look at relay races, they sort of start running a little bit at the same time, so they're parallel. So that's a great analogy. I think it is trying to be that. And interestingly, I had some feedback yesterday. I got a WhatsApp message from a former colleague of mine who is a sales engineering leader, and he gave me some feedback on the article. And he said, in his experience, there's often a lot of antagonism where at the end of that production line, we're looking at everything that came before it as basically our enemy, right? And I think a lot of that can come from, I didn't have any context, so I was just on the tail end of some pretty poor sales practices, right? Or like we sold to a non-ICP customer, or we sold because they didn't really have a pain, they just had budget they wanted to get rid of. Well, you may not be able to solve that there, but if you had context of it, at least then in your territory plan, you could decide to prioritize differently. You go, oh, you know what? I'm not going to get anywhere with this customer, right? Because they haven't got anyone assigned and blah, blah, blah. I'll flag it right now with my leadership going, hey, this is a churn risk. It's non-ICP. Yeah. It'd be much better to know that up front. But I think it's also about not having that antagonist, not having an oppositional view, like they're in sales and I'm doing something else, right? Yeah. It's like, it's really and part of that is if we just speak the same language, there's probably going to be less antagonism. And guess what? Sometimes that antagonism is warranted. It is absolutely warranted. But that is it, rather than kind of throw your hands up and go, God, they're all evil. It's like, well, what can I do practically myself? Build relationships, listen to calls. Even if it's like, I just got to cater to this sales leader's ego, so they let me sit in the back of the room and listen. Yeah. All of that's going to help you, right?
Yeah. I think if we look at, I guess, what happened last year, the real focus, it was sales, right? Businesses were, we need to sell more, we're losing customers, we need to sell more. And that has perhaps led to some questionable sales practices, and that's created that friction even further. It's just kind of added a bit of fuel.
I spoke with a sales leader a couple of weeks back who said, well, Rav, we only closed the non-ICP deals in the last 2 weeks of the quarter. By way of justification. And it's like, I hear you. I know you're under pressure, but you see, in the end of the day, that's shooting all of us in the foot, including you. Yeah. Because when we lose that revenue, you and the team are going to just have to work even harder and get a bigger target next quarter, right? Or next year, right? So it's short versus long term. And I think that's also maybe another historical challenge, which is I got one group which is culturally quite different, working on a 12-week window of the world, and I've got another group which is culturally different, working on a 12-month window on the world.
Yeah.
And I think that so trying to do some of these things like getting connected to the pipeline, understanding why people buy, getting more context, that will kind of help you to, at least from your side, bridge part of that. Those gaps. Yeah.
And also the really important part within the article is talking about driving a faster time to value. And that's another metric, which I think would be a really interesting one to track. If you are more connected to the sales pipeline and you can show that by doing that, the output is actually we're onboarding customers faster, we're reaching value with customers more swiftly.
100%. So your typical sort of kickoff call on the customer side is, so Luke, what's success look like for you? What do you want to achieve? Whereas really what you'd ideally be coming to that call going, so we've been working with your boss and this is what they want to have happen.
Yeah.
How does that sound? Right. You want to become, because again, if you're selling up here and working with people down there, they may have a completely different view of the world. Right. And they may not even know why the thing was bought and what their boss wants to, or the CEO wants to achieve. So it'd be better just to come to the meeting with that. Like, so what we've been told by your leadership who bought this thing is they want to see X, right? Yeah. It kind of gets hard to then, push back on that. So this is not from us. This is from your leaders. Yeah. This is the pain they want to solve. Right?
Yeah. Awesome. So I guess this moves on nicely into the next part of your article, and we covered a lot of it anyway, I think, but just the refining and development of common sales skills, which it does kind of intertwine. But one part we talked about, you talked about, was kind of commercial aversion in customer success, which has kind of led to being at the it's a result, of being at the tail end of
the tail end. Yeah, and quite understandably, like I've been dumped on by poor sales practices. And it's perfectly understandable. But I think the point of that section in the article was because you're at the tail end of that production line and you may not have much exposure to what's happened before, either in the pipeline or how these deals are run or why people buy, you may not realize that actually you are doing virtually identical things to your sales counterparts. Yeah. Right? You're trying to understand problems and pains. You're trying to quantify those. You're looking for success criteria. You're coming up to renewal. You're trying to build an ROI case. You're doing project management as a customer person. You're project managing a deployment. Well, they project management deals. They're handling objections. You're handling objections. They're constantly trying to influence and negotiate. You're trying to influence and negotiate your stakeholders to do things on top of their busy day job. Yeah. So the point was really, you might be surprised that actually a lot of what you do as two groups is almost exactly the same, requiring a lot of the same skills.
Yeah, and you've said it many times when we've spoken in the past that really good salespeople tend to be well aligned in terms of skill set to really good customer success professionals. There's certainly a lot of overlap.
Well, the best explanation I've heard is from Mark Roberge, who was the first CRO at HubSpot, which he says, sales is the process of delivering value. And if you deliver value, revenue is the outcome. Right. And I think that is spot on. Right. Yeah. And the customer organization is all about delivering value. But I think what tends to happen is because they're outwardly focused and they've been told to be outwardly focused, they go, well, I'm trying to deliver value to the customer's company. Yeah. But there's a second part of that statement, which would be the customer's company and my own. Yeah. Right? Okay. And this is what my company cares about. So I've got to balance these two interests to make sure I'm delivering on both.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. Good stuff. If you're watching this and you're in CS, are there any resources you would start to direct people towards? So any literature that will get them more into the language of sales that you've read and you think would resonate?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the best learning is through your own internal organization, sit in the back of the room, listening to call. Like if you have 6 stages in your sales cycle before it gets closed, maybe you listen in at stage 5. You don't say anything, you don't do anything, you just listen. Yeah. You listen to recordings. There is a plethora of material out there. I mentioned Mark Roberge, his book, The Sales Acceleration Formula, is actually probably the best CS book I've ever read, even though it's about sales. If you actually unpick it, it's really a customer success book. Yeah. I would say, maybe Mark would disagree. So I think, that is a good read. I'll give a shout out on Medium. I'm working with a colleague of mine, Ben Wright, on a series of articles about early stage foundational go to market. How do you do outbound? How do you do inbound? Those are all kind of consumable 6, 7, 8 minute reads. People may find that useful. I think that there's a plethora of material, but I think there's no substitute for just exposing yourself to it as much as you can. Yeah, in the real world, right? And use your own company as a way to learn.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And the Sales Acceleration Formula, I read that book many years ago. There is a section in there. If you're a hiring manager, there's a section in there which talks about profiling and characteristic scoring. Yeah. Is so good. It's really
and actually on that, there's a book called Who by Jeff Smart and Randy Street, which is a framework for hiring, very much focused on behavioral traits as well as skills and experience. That is an exceptionally good read. And I think actually a really good read for CS folk as well, or people who are in CS leadership. I do a lot of work with CS leaders who are like, oh, I'm on my 4th round of hiring and this is just not working out. And it's like, oh, well, let's look at the Who framework and let's build a hiring scorecard and think about behaviors and build a question bank, etc. And that's an incredibly useful framework for people to read about as well.
What, so you don't tell them to use ABR? What's going on?
Yeah. But as a recruiter, if someone came to you and said, Luke, here's a job description, but here's the hiring scorecard, and these are the behaviors I'm looking for, and these are some questions I'd like you to ask to test these behaviors.
Yeah.
Your ability to find them a closer fit candidate gets much higher, doesn't it?
Yeah, and it's actually what we do. Whenever we brief in on a position, we take the spec, but we have an hour kickoff where we effectively build a scorecard. So it's finding all of the key points that would actually excite them when they see a profile. Beyond that, it is the characteristics. It's
basically teasing out, you've got the role, but what are the, and again, we were talking about activities and reporting. The job description is a list of activities you want people to do.
Yeah.
The scorecard is how you want them to do it.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Exactly. And so I think, in terms of literature, I would definitely recommend that. I'd recommend Mark's book. There's a couple of other books whose names escape me, but I'll send them to you. Maybe you can link them into the article, into the video when you.
That'd be amazing. What we'll do actually is we made a bit of a joke about the name of the podcast, but I'm actually being quite serious. We'll give away all of those books to the person that.
Oh yeah.
I think that's a good shout. We'll do that. Yeah. We'll do that.
Spread the knowledge. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. The bit though, which is I think a great wrap up, is just ring the sales bell. Yeah. We do it here. So we use. Where's it gone? We have a soundboard wherever we book an interview or we make a placement. We've got different sounds in the office, like a klaxon sound.
Yeah.
But, and I think it's really important. And I love this part of the article because I don't know if a lot of teams do celebrate, when the renewals come through or when an upsell's happened, or I don't know if it's celebrated the same.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think it's my experience talking to lots of practitioners and leaders is it's not something they ever think about doing. Again, I think it's a byproduct of I'm being asked to be outwardly focused. I'm being asked to make my customer the champion and the hero. So I'm naturally self-effacing. I don't think about doing that internally. But again, it goes back to culture and speaking the language that the company understands and helping the company to connect what you are doing to things that the company cares about. And there's nothing stopping you from doing this, at all, right? No one can stop you from going to Slack going, hey, I want to shout out Luke. We had an excellent renewal and upsell at blah, blah, blah. And he's been working really hard with the stakeholders. And here's the people he's been partnering with internally. No one is going to complain about that. And if you just keep a drumbeat of those things happening, it starts to seep in and people sort of understand, I know, I hear from this team when XYZ happens, when we hit this, we beat our daily active usage target, or we hit this NRR GRR number.
Yeah.
And this goes back to what we talked about reporting and forecasting. If you pick certain things that, you're like, these are what we're going to track because these are important to the company, even if you're not on the hook for those numbers, you can still share when those numbers in your territories are exceeded or met because you have influenced them on how they happen. So the example I always give is sales engineers, right? Sales engineers get compensated on deal closure, but they don't do any pricing negotiation or redlining of contracts, and they don't deal with procurement. But we all understand that they help deals get closed, and that's why we pay them.
Yeah.
Right? And that's how we pay them. So that's a really good model, I think, for CS leaders and practitioners, is to go, we may not have sat and done the negotiation on the renewal and the upsell, but all the work we did all the way up to that created the conditions to allow that to happen.
Yeah.
So let's shout about it.
Yeah,
right?
Agreed.
And let's shout out to Luke, who did the actual negotiation, even though he may not be in our team.
I think there is a similar story within marketing, and I've talked about this a few times with others. But marketing used to be, and I'm really sorry, marketers. I love marketing, by the way. I used to do a lot of recruitment in marketing. It used to be the colouring in department for a lot of businesses, but that's how it was perceived. It's like, well, they just do like the nice looking stuff. And there was a lot of pressure on marketing to show value. And I think over time, that's when we start to see a lot more MQLs. Like we start to see, right, if we do this, we get the following output. The return on investment looks like this, and the language within marketing evolved over the years. But there used to be a divide between marketing and sales, and there's still friction with every department. But I do think there's a common link there, and CS is on that evolutionary trail. And it is just about perception.
I think that I 100% agree, Lee, and I think that marketing example is a really good one, because it's that thing we were talking about earlier about how you report, how you talk, and focusing on outcomes. It used to be very common for marketing to report up. The whole company will have to say, "Oh, we did 10 events, and this is how many people came."
Yeah.
Right. And these are the events we've got planned. As opposed to now, we had 10 events. This is how many people came, and this is how many marketing qualified leads that were generated, and this is then how many sales accepted opportunities came out of that. Everyone is starting to understand, oh, I know why you did those activities now, because they translated into something that the company cares about. It's the same thing you're suggesting people do on their CV. It's the same thing we're suggesting in the article that CS teams do.
Yeah. Awesome. And I guess we're running out of time. We booked in, didn't we, till booked in an hour, so we're getting close to that now. So, and you may not be able to share this because it would be naming a business, but are there any success stories where they weren't revenue aligned and now they are, and it's made a massive impact?
Well, interestingly, it's a company that I did some work with a couple of years ago, probably about 18 months, 2 years ago. It's not that they weren't revenue aligned. It's just like they were so swamped with all the stuff that didn't have an owner that no one else wanted to do, that they struggled to do the things that would help actually drive fast time to value and revenue, because they were just getting deflected by all this other stuff. So I worked with the team and their leadership on essentially rebuilding the whole organization and putting a plan together. And it was a payroll company. They did international payroll. And actually one of the very big parts of that work was they completely rebranded and changed the name of the team and changed the name of the role. And they said, well, we're the international payroll team, and these are all international payroll specialists. And so as soon as the company started going, oh, you need to do this, it's about customers, going, no, that's got nothing to do with international payroll. That's not what we do. What we're here to do is to roll out the payroll in the first country and then roll it out into as many other countries as possible as quickly as we can. And so what they were able to do actually was rebuild the team, change its perception, change how it was measured, change its name, got a lot better at pushing back on stuff that didn't have an owner. And then they were actually able to show, well, here's the outcome in terms of usage and revenue. We rolled out to this country, this country, this country, which incrementally is more license revenue. Even though they weren't targeted on the revenue, they were able to show by doing X, Y, Z, the company got more revenue.
Awesome. Yeah. No, it's really, really good. Really good. One final question, conscious of time.
Sure.
How do you foresee customer success evolving then over the next few years? I don't want to look too far ahead.
Yeah. Look, it's a really interesting question. We talked about AI earlier at the top of the call. I think AI, right now, I think businesses and teams and CS teams are probably looking at AI as a workforce enabler. I can automate workflow. But really, I think what's going to happen is more and more of the Microsoft Copilots of the world will start to get built, and they'll start to get embedded in products. And a lot of the things which CS teams are traditionally doing, like helping the customer configure the software or to drive adoption or onboarding, the products are going to get better and better and better in doing that themselves, right? And so that, I think, is going to be quite significant change over the next 3, 4, 5 years. And it's something I think CS teams need to brace for by, again, I think, taking advantage of some of these opportunities about getting closer to revenue, understanding the pipeline, talking a different language, because that will inevitably lead to some kind of shrinkage in, if not size of team, in certain team responsibilities, for sure.
Yeah, agreed. I think it's hard to imagine losing the relationship element. So I think CS is always going to have a huge amount of value, because companies value human to human kind of contact when it comes to.
I think the role will always be required. I think it will change in terms of what it's responsible for and what it's doing and who it's doing that with. Because the products are going to get a lot better at doing the lower level stuff that's taking manual effort right now. If you have a product which, is using AI and machine learning and all this massive data set the company has to say, well, when Luke logs in and he clicks on these 3 things, I actually know what he needs to do next, and I'll prompt him to do it, or I'll make it happen for him ahead of time.
Yeah.
Or actually the admin can now just, in natural language, answer 20 questions that the system asks them, and it gets configured.
Yeah.
Right. Then maybe I want to review that and come in and help them tune it. You're starting to see how that's going to have a profound effect on this function and this role. I think right now everyone's mindset is, oh, it's workflow. It's going to just help me with my calls to action or automate my responses and this sort of stuff. That is super low hanging fruit. I think that is just going to that's already commoditized, really. Yeah. I think it's the Copilot type solutions of the world. Someone is going to invent an API which just lets you do Copilot type thing in any product.
Yeah.
And that's going to happen, I'm sure. Yeah.
And I would say, if you're not looking at AI right now, if you've not even played with the likes of ChatGPT and you're in customer success, I highly recommend just start looking outwardly and looking at different tools, etc.
And just on this, to round off, I had a really good comment a while back, which is like, AI is not going to take your job, but someone using AI is.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's the lesson there, I think. Yeah.
What a point to end on, Rav.
Yeah, there you go.
But no, you're an absolute gem. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this. It's been great, really insightful. I'd love to do this again.
Yeah, and thank you for inviting me along. It's been great fun.